Okay, and I have 10:02, so for the sake of time, I think we'll go ahead and get started here. This is recorded. We will share it with you afterwards, and we can include the slides as well so that you have it and can share as you see fit. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is a webinar covering the relatively new reserve study law and what reserves and reserve studies are. My name is Michelle Baldry. I'm with Reserve Advisors. We're a firm here in the area that specializes in reserve studies. So I'll be covering the portion that covers really what the reserve studies are, what reserves are. And my friend Nicole here is here as well.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Williams. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Reese Broom. We specialize in a lot of different areas of the law, but we also specialize in representing community associations, condo associations, homeowner associations, and cooperatives in Maryland, DC, and Virginia. And so I will be talking about some of the legal stuff as it relates to what is now being legally required regarding reserve studies in Montgomery County and Prince George's County. And in addition to that, I also have the luxury of also serving in the Maryland General Assembly. And so got to see the enactment of both of these bills firsthand from that vantage point. So just really happy to be here and happy to see all of your lovely faces this morning.
Great. Thanks, Nicole. So before we dive into the content, just a real quick going over the agenda here, just so everyone knows what to expect. Nicole first will cover what the law is. The next, I'll be covering what reserves are, what a reserve study is, how as a manager or board member you would facilitate that reserve study, and then once when you receive it, how to interpret it. So with that, we'll get started.
Yes. And also, too, as we're going along, if you have any questions that you're thinking of, please put your questions in the chat. We will try to address those questions either as we're going along, as well as at the end. We have allotted some time for Q&A at the end as well. So do not hold back if you have any questions. So one of the first questions is, what is the law? And so in 2020, House Bill 254 was passed, which was solely related to Prince George's County. And that bill was a bill that came out of the Prince George's County delegation and then went to the full General Assembly for passage. And it only affected Prince George's County. And then in 2021, really exact same bill was passed, House Bill 567 for Montgomery County. And both of the bills read very similar. The only difference is just the enactment date on both of the bills. So the Prince George's County bill went into effect on October the 1st, 2020. The Montgomery County bill went into effect October 1st, 2021. So Montgomery County folks have had a kind of an additional year than the Prince George's County folks. But basically what both of these bills do, both of these bills basically state that if you are a condo association, a homeowners association, or a cooperative association, you must have a reserve study completed once every 5 years. And so for those communities, if you are in a community where you just got a reserve study done in 2019, for an example, then you don't need to get another reserve study done until 5 years from then, 5 years from that point. So that would be 2024 for you. However, when both of these bills went into effect on October 1st, if you did not have a reserve study done ever, or it's been more than 5 years since your last reserve study, once that bill went into effect, you have 1 year in which to get a reserve study completed. So for those common ownership communities in Montgomery County, like I said, the bill just went into effect literally 14 days ago. And so now starting October 1st of this year, you have a full 1 year in which to get a reserve study completed if you have not had one done in the last 5 years. So you have 1 year to get that done. And then once that year is over with, when we get to next year, if you're in Montgomery County, or this year, if you're in Prince George's County, you are required then to ensure that your budget that you are adopting is allocating funds in accordance with the most recent reserve study that you have gotten completed. And I know a lot of people have asked, well, why is this bill important? Why would, the legislature decide that something like this needs to take place? And I will say, number one, there are lots of other states that have similar legislation on their books. Our neighbors to the south, Virginia, being one of them, actually has something very similar in their Condominium Act and in their Homeowners Association Act. But there are a number of states across the country that have had similar legislation for years. Number two, making sure that an association is adequately setting aside funds for reserve really is in the best interest of the association as a whole, and really helps to maintain the association's fiscal health. Their reserves are, as Michelle will get into a little later, are really to fund for capital improvements, those long-term projects, not just your regular general maintenance that you have to do all the time every year, but it's, if you're in a condo association, it's to set aside funds to replace that roof when that roof exhausts its useful life. It is to replace that monument sign at the entryway of your community that's going to deteriorate over time because of snow and rain, and for those who remember the earthquake and things like that. And so your reserve study is really important. And in fact, it's so important that the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, if you are a condominium association and you're trying to seek FHA approval, FHA will not grant you FHA approval as a condo association unless you can show that you are adequately budgeting for reserves in accordance with your most recent reserve study. And they like to see that the reserve studies have been done actually within the last 3 years in which you are applying for FHA approval, not even necessarily 5 years. And so HUD and FHA have seen that typically associations that are funding their reserves in a healthy manner are usually communities where they're not having to rob Peter to pay Paul when something breaks or when something explodes or whatever the case might be. And so, over the summer, we just witness kind of a worst case scenario in Florida, where a community was aware they had gotten a report from a structural engineer that there were items that needed to be repaired. And those items were going to cost millions of dollars for that condo association. And the condo association did not have the funds immediately to move forward with those repairs. And so, according to the news reports, and I'm just going by the news reports, they were contemplating doing a special assessment to all of the homeowners, which was going to cost each homeowner thousands and thousands of dollars because they didn't have enough funds set aside in their reserves in order to move forward with those structural improvements that needed to take place. So I just, that's worst case scenario. Prayerfully, we will never, ever see something like that again, because that was absolutely horrific. But that's what reserves do. And so as this bill was being debated, both in 2020 and in 2021, that was part of the conversations that were being had about why we needed to have something like this. Starting off in Prince George's County and Montgomery County, but we may see this enacted statewide. So going back to the bill itself, as I mentioned, you must budget in accordance to your most recent reserve study. And there is a provision in the bill that does state that the board can increase its assessment to ensure that it's adequately funding the reserves. Even if there's a provision in your governing documents that may cap your assessments, the increase of your assessments for a particular fiscal year. And I've seen that in a lot of governing documents. You may have a provision in your declaration or in your bylaws that state, the assessments cannot increase more than, say, 5% or 10% or something like that. And that's a very common provision that you will find in a lot of association documents. But if you have that provision in your documents and you're trying to comply with this act and you realize, oh my God, Nicole, we're going to have to, our documents say we can't increase our budget by more than 5% from the previous year. But in order for us to adequately fund our reserves, we're actually going to have to increase it maybe 7%. Under this statute, that's okay. You can increase your budget by 7% to ensure that you're complying with this bill, and it would not be deemed a violation of your declaration and your bylaws. So, and let's see, I see a question in the chat. Our associations facing a very high increase in our insurance premium for 2022. Is this happening at every association around? Well, we'll get to that kind of as we get closer to the end. That's a little bit separate from the reserves and reserve situation. And so I will kind of let you know what I'm seeing on my end, just from our clients as it relates to insurance premiums. What does fully funded mean? Got it, absolutely. And Michelle will get into this a little in a much greater detail than I will, but generally your reserve study will provide to you a timeline. And it will say for each component that will need to get repaired. So let's go back to the roof example I gave earlier today. If you are a condo association and you know you're going to need a new roof, say in 7 years from now, according to your reserve study, according to the engineer who came out and inspected the roof and said that the roof is probably good for another 7 years. And then your reserve study is going to say, okay, 7 years from now, it's going to cost you X number of dollars to replace that roof 7 years from now. Let's just say it's going to cost $1 million to replace that roof 7 years from now. What your reserve study will do is take that $1 million that you're going to need in 7 years and break that up for, over the next 7 years. And I guess to 1/7. And I'm an attorney, not a mathematician, so I don't know what that dollar amount would be. But divide that $1 million by 7 and say, okay, over the next 7 years, you need to put aside this amount of money. So by the time we get to the 7th year, you will have that $1 million that you will need to replace that roof when it's exhausted its useful life at that point. That's what we mean by fully funded. So hopefully that answers your question there, Brenda. Let's see. And then the next question I see, I have communities that have no assets. Are there provisions for these communities to opt out? So if you do not have anything that would require any type of capital improvement, so you do not, which is a little rare, at the minimum, most communities will have at a minimum a monument sign. And under the bill, you don't necessarily have to hire the most expensive engineer in the world in which to get this reserve study done. And Michelle's probably not going to like me saying this, but under the bill, you can actually get anyone who has, say, a degree in engineering, who is a certified architect here in the state of Maryland, who's a certified engineer here in the state of Maryland, as well as someone like Michelle, who is a certified reserve specialist or a certified structural engineer. So if you have someone who lives in your community who's a certified architect or certified engineer, that person can simply write up a report on behalf of the association saying that the association does not have any assets. Therefore, there isn't a need to set aside any funds in the reserve because there aren't any monument signs. We're not responsible for repaving parking lots. There isn't a roof I need to replace. There aren't any underground pipes that are common area pipes that I'm going to have to replace. If you literally have 0 common areas or elements that you have to take care of, 0, then you can have someone write that out for you and get that done every 5 years, and you will be in compliance with the law. And yes, we will provide the slides after the presentation. I will have to check with Michelle about getting a recording of the video as well, but we definitely will provide a copy of the slides. And so about the management company, does the management company or the HOA have to report to the county or state that the reserve study has been completed? No, that's not really required, not at this point. We're just asking everyone to operate in good faith that they will get this done. I will say though, that if you do not get it done and a homeowner finds out about it, and a disgruntled homeowner finds out about it, they could report the association to the Attorney General's office. And the Attorney General's office does have the right to enforce violations of the Maryland Condominium Act as well as the Maryland Homeowners Association Act. So that would be, I guess, kind of the teeth in this particular bill. But no, you're not required to notify the county or the state that the reserve study has been completed. So, okay, and I see Michelle just put, yes, we will be providing the recording and the slides via email. So see, Michelle's on it. She's so on top of all of this. Let's see, and that's it. I see another question, must include the budgeted amount required by the most recent reserve study. Hopefully I kind of answered that with my condominium roof example. Let's see here, but yes, other funding source, they're talking about, okay, one funding source is in our communities via our HOA fees, which is the primary source for most communities. But there are some communities that may receive income other ways, whether if you have amenities like a pool or something, you may have pool fees that you collect. For some condos, especially high-rise condominiums, sometimes they may lease a portion of their roof to, say, cell phone companies and receive income that way. So, if you receive income sources from a multiple different sources, that's perfectly fine. The key isn't necessarily where the money is coming from, but making sure that you're budgeting for those reserves. So yeah, the resale fee is another source of income. So that the law doesn't really dictate where the money comes from. It's just really going to be based on making sure you're budgeting accordingly. Okay. And I think that's it for those questions. So yeah, those extra fees would satisfy the legal requirement. So, okay, it looks like someone wrote that I lost the audio. Is everyone able to hear? Okay.
Yeah, I apologize. I think my computer, it just dropped the internet real quick, but hopefully, can everyone see the screen share? Is that back for everybody?
Okay, I see the screen share.
Okay. And everyone can hear okay?
Yes, someone typed I can hear and see.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. And yeah, I recently just received that same question, Nicole, about funding through alternate streams. And what I always tell clients is that the reserve study is going to provide that funding recommendation, that this is how reserves needs to be funded. And then ultimately it's up to the association, if they have those other revenue streams, to estimate those, how you're going to carve that out from fees or any other revenue streams. But the reserve study will just provide that holistic, this is the amount that needs to go towards reserves. And then the board has the authority to carve that out accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so I think that's it for this slide. Let's see.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Nicole. Now that we understand the law, I'll dive into what reserves are and how studies are conducted, and feel free to use the chat if this prompts any other questions about the law or reserves or studies. Just ask away. We're here and happy to help. So let's start with what reserves are. Nicole did explain it really well, but I included a slide too. It's really funds that are specifically allocated for capital repair and replacement of common elements that the association is responsible for maintaining. So Nicole had a great example. The budget is going to have annual type expenses, right? So maybe management fees, insurance, could be landscaping, pool maintenance, any of those general costs that occur on an annual basis. And then within that budget, there should be a line item for reserves, essentially a reserve contribution to that reserve account. And that reserve account is really intended for those big ticket items, less frequent projects that if you had to incorporate in the budget when you need to replace a roof or repave streets, it would drastically just kind of blow up your budget, right? Essentially, you'd have to special assess. So the goal is to put money away on an annual basis, a small amount, relatively stable amount with just inflationary increases, so that when the time comes for those projects, you can pull those funds right from that reserve account and not have to special assess. So when we say common elements, what exactly does that mean? Well, it is something that the association is responsible for maintaining. How do you determine that? Ideally, your governing documents will spell that out. It will list a section of common elements, limited common elements, homeowner responsibility. Unfortunately, we know those documents aren't always quite crystal clear. Your reserve specialist, while they are great at evaluating those common elements and putting together a reserve study, they are not the correct profession to interpret them. So we're happy to read them, review them. If they're very clear, we can, read and interpret the same way. But if there is any ambiguity, we do really recommend you seek an opinion from your attorney, such as Nicole, to really spell out the true responsibilities and kind of read between the lines and help you spell that out. We've had associations that have worked with an attorney to prepare like a responsibility matrix if the documents don't already include one, and it will be really clear so everyone has an understanding. This is the association's responsibility, this is the homeowner's responsibility, these are how things are repaired versus replaced and maintained. So if there is any uncertainty, we recommend seeking a legal opinion on that. But then it's also important to consider historical practice as well. So maybe there's a perimeter fence around the community that a neighboring association actually owns, but your side of the fence you guys historically paint. Well, that information just needs to be relayed to the reserve specialist so they are aware of what the association maintains. And really those common expenditures will help us determine a qualified reserve component. When we say common, you might hear common versus limited common. Well, what's the difference? So a common element is portions of the condominium or HOA that all units have access to, right? It's something that is a common component that is maintained by the association. A limited common element, so this is still something that the association maintains, but typically the declaration will provide exclusive use to one or more, but less than all units. So a real common example might be a balcony or a deck. It might be something that the association maintains. It is a common element, but it's really limited to that homeowner that has direct access. If Nicole and I live in the same condominium and she has a limited common balcony, I'm still contributing to the eventual replacement of that balcony, but I can't go use Nicole's balcony. She has that direct access. It's limited to her use, but it is considered a common component the association will maintain. So now that we've discussed those common components, what is a reserve study? Well, it really is a two-part analysis. It has both a physical evaluation and a financial analysis of your community. CAI has put together a four-part test to really help determine what reserve components are. First and foremost, like we just discussed, that common element, it has to be the association's maintenance responsibility, right? So it does have to be a common element that the association is responsible for maintaining. Next, it has to have a limited useful life. And by limited, we mean that it will need to occur within the duration of the study. So a standard kind of typical duration is 30 years. And so what that means is we are looking at from today, the time the study is completed, what expenses do we anticipate for the association over the next 30 years? Which components have this limited useful life? So an example I'd like to use is a pool. If it's a brand new community that was just constructed, say a year ago, and we're doing a reserve study today, there are going to be various reserve line items or expenses, reserve expenses associated with that pool. We know you're going to need to replaster or white coat it, replace the tile and the coping, perform deck repairs, replace the fence, there's mechanical equipment, all the pumps, filtration, maybe a heater. You're going to replace the furniture. There's going to be a lot of capital costs in addition to just the routine chlorine, pool maintenance and cleaning. There's operating expenses, then there's those reserve expenses. But the actual pool structure itself, that concrete structure and all the plumbing, has a really long useful life. That's more like, say, 60 years, right? So if it's a brand new community, we're going to have all those reserve costs that we just mentioned, but that full structure replacement, you're not going to need to fund for that just yet, which is why it's so important to update these studies every 5 years. We don't have crystal balls, so we can't predict exactly what's going to happen 28 years from now, but we do want you to start funding for those components. And as you update every 5 years, those things are refined based on condition, how things are holding up, and things like that, right? So as the community continues to age, in addition to refining the timing and cost for these components, those long items like a pool structure or subsurface utilities or plumbing in a high-rise building will get incorporated into the reserve study as it ages. So it does have a limited useful life. We are focused on the duration of the study, which again is typically 30 years. The component also has to have a predictable remaining life. That Nicole mentioned the earthquake. I was going to mention that one as well as an example. At the time of the earthquake, associations started getting terrified. They said, oh no, this could continue to happen. We need to incorporate into the reserve study an earthquake contingency. They wanted a contingency line item. If we have to use insurance, we want that deductible covered. We just want kind of a cushion for these future earthquakes. And we said, well, that's pretty difficult to predict. You don't want to start funding for things that may or may not happen, right? That's something really outside of a typical expense. We know you're going to have to replace a roof or replace piping, but an earthquake or a fire, those are things that really you can't predict, and you shouldn't be collecting fees and funding for these unknowns, essentially. And then lastly, it has to be above a minimum threshold. You don't want to bog the reserve study down with these really small expenses that really should be funded through general maintenance. A general rule of thumb that we like to use is 1% of the budget. So if your budget's $200,000, we'd say that cutoff should probably start around $2,000, meaning anything below that, general maintenance and operating, anything above that, a capital reserve expense that should be included in the reserve study and something that would be funded through reserves. So now that we know what the reserve study will include, the type of components that are included, how is the reserve study conducted? Well, again, it's that physical evaluation and a financial analysis. And the goal is really to provide adequate funding for the association. So let's dive into these two parts a little bit. The physical evaluation, well, what does that entail? Well, the first step is the meeting. So there's typically a kickoff meeting. The reserve specialist is going to meet with any community stakeholders. So typically the manager, could be board members, could be committee members if you have like a finance committee. We encourage you to invite anyone that's going to actively use the reserve study or has history on the property to attend that kickoff meeting. So what are we doing during the meeting? Well, that's where we're discussing that scope of responsibility, making sure that we're all on the same page about those common components. We're going to discuss the history. What's gone on? When have you last replaced the roofs? When have you repaired the sidewalks? How old is your playground? What projects do you have planned? Do you have a renovation of your clubhouse scheduled for next year? We want to understand what's gone on historically, and then also any plans that you have. And then we're also going to review that operating budget, right? We want to make sure that we're on the same page as far as what's typically funded through reserves or what should be funded through reserves. We don't want to double up or have a shortfall, meaning we don't want to include things to be funded from reserves and included in the reserve study if in actuality you fund it from operating. But we also don't want to assume you're going to fund things through operating if you prefer to fund it in reserves. So it's really alignment just to make sure that the reserve specialist understands how the association operates. After that meeting, the next step is the inspection of the community. So this is where the reserve specialist is really kind of focusing on those components. In the meeting, we've determined what those components are, and now we need to actually view them, right? So what is the reserve specialist doing? We're looking at the condition and the life expectancy of the components. So what condition is your roof in or your pool furniture? We're really looking at the condition of everything. It's going to help us determine that replacement timing. On the life expectancy, there are some standard kind of general life expectancies, but then those are typically refined based on the region. Any unique weather conditions, coastal exposure, for example, will affect the life expectancy, as well as quality of materials used, right? Not all retaining walls are created equal. Is it a timber wall? Is it a masonry wall? And you can do the same for any component. If it's a balcony, is it a composite? Is it wood? Is it concrete? What are the materials that are used? And that will determine the typical life expectancy for that component. The reserve specialist is also going to look at the manner of replacement. Is everything in the same general condition? Are all the roofs, was the community constructed around the same time? They're all in the same general condition. Maybe it makes sense to replace all of the roofs or paint all of the buildings in one cycle, as opposed to phasing them out. But maybe it is a really large master plan community with 30 miles of streets, and they're all in various condition. That might be something that we are going to phase based on the condition and the time of installation. Maybe that will be a project that's phased over time. Or it might even be a component that only needs to be partially replaced. It's very, very rare for associations to have to go in and replace all of the concrete at one time, right? Typically, we see concrete fail at different times, and you're only going to partially replace sections. So that's something that we might show just periodic partial replacements of. So really that condition will help us determine the manner of replacement. We're also going to look for factors that will affect the replacement costs. You can't just say that a retaining wall is $50 a square foot to replace, right? Where is that retaining wall located? What's the size of it? Is it, if it's a small, pretty easy access retaining wall right along the street, that's going to be much cheaper than, say, a 5-foot wall tucked behind the homes up along a conservation area, right? Where it's much more difficult to access that retaining wall. So we're going to look at those various factors. Is the condensing unit for the HVAC right outside the clubhouse, or is it up on top of the roof? So we're doing that for every single component to try and provide the most accurate replacement cost. And then we're also going to help prioritize projects. It's fairly common for associations to be underfunded, and there are some components that can wait. Right? If you're a mid-rise building and your carpet's aging, or even in your clubhouse, you don't have to. That's more of a discretionary thing, right? You might like new carpet or new clubhouse furniture, but that can wait. If funds are limited, we're going to recommend you replace that roof or keep the HVAC working before replacing the carpet. So we will help prioritize those for you. We want to focus on those items that really are a safety concern, or if you don't perform it right away, the longer it goes, the more it'll deteriorate. So even streets, you can argue that we can live with some potholes, right? That's not a true need, but you do have to think about the cost associated with that. The longer the pavement erodes, it's going to deteriorate that base. And maybe before you could have milled and overlaid a much cheaper repaving project, but if the base erodes, now you're going to need to rip that out and totally replace the pavement, right? So there are some projects that it is better to be proactive, and we're going to help you with that and make sure that you're really prioritizing and focusing on the true needs of the association. So that physical evaluation really helped us determine that expenditure plan. When we have the needs determined, that expenditure plan, the next step is the financial analysis. So it's the true cash flow. What are the financial needs of the association? So we're going to have that starting fund balance, which you're providing to the reserve specialist, right? You're telling us at the time the study is conducted, how much do we have in reserves? It might be zero, it might be $1 million. You're telling us, as of today, this is the starting balance. You're also going to provide the current year income and expenses. So we're not going to recommend changing mid-year. We know that's not feasible, right? So we're going to start with that starting balance. We're going to include your current year contributions. We're going to include an interest rate. We can use either a 30-year average. We can use your current interest rate. We're going to include inflation. So that goes both on the cost, the expense side, as well as the contributions. We don't want you contributing the same amount today as you are in, say, 30 years, just due to the value of the dollar. So inflation will be incorporated. And then ultimately, we're going to provide a funding recommendation. So what's excluded from a reserve study? We talked about what's included. So just kind of the reverse. Important to remember, homeowner components excluded. We are not looking at things that the individual homeowners are responsible for. We don't want to bog the study down with these really small, minor, routine maintenance, general operating type expenses, as well as any general maintenance. So if it's a project you do annually, It should not be funded through reserves. That's more of an operating expense, just done on a routine basis, as opposed to these big ticket items, reserve type expenses. So how do you, as a board or manager, really facilitate that reserve study? What's your role in getting the reserve study produced? You know, you need to do it. You've signed the contract. You know what's going to happen now as part of the reserve study process. Well, what's your role? What are you responsible for? So to help the reserve specialist, it's really helpful to have some information ahead of time. The items that the reserve specialist is typically going to want to see are these financial documents. So the budget and then that financial balance sheet. So we have that starting reserve balance. It's helpful for the engineer reserve specialist to review that ahead of time so that we can have a productive conversation to go over it at that kickoff meeting. We're going to want to see those declaration and bylaws. That'll help us review it ahead of time, get our arms around what we understand to be the common components, and that way we can have a productive conversation with you at that kickoff meeting. Any capital projects. So if you currently have projects underway or you've signed a contract for an upcoming project, it's helpful to provide that to the reserve specialist ahead of time so that we can review it, understand what's going on, and discuss with you how that should be reflected in the reserve study. If it's a project underway, how much have you already paid of that project? What exactly is going on so that we'll understand what that project will look like when it's done and how to reflect it properly in the reserve study. And then lastly, your interest rates. So again, we can use your typical, current rate, or we can use a projected estimate for interest since the study is over 30 years. And as a reminder, the two parts of that reserve study are that physical evaluation and a financial analysis. So for the physical evaluation, during that meeting, how do you facilitate it? Well, it's typically at the beginning of the day. We like to do it before that inspection, get everyone aligned before the actual inspection occurs. As far as who should attend, again, those community stakeholders, right? So board members with historical knowledge of the community are really helpful. If there's a treasurer that's going to use it, they're usually pretty helpful. But we do encourage you to limit it. We don't want to have this reserve study kickoff meeting in conjunction with a regular board meeting where there's a lot of other things going on. This meeting should be separate and really focused on just the reserve study to make sure that it is a productive meeting. All reserve specialists will encourage you to bring any specific questions or concerns that you have. If there is a retaining wall that you're concerned about, we want to know about it. Or if you're wondering how a certain component of the reserve study is conducted, ask away. That's really your time to make sure that everyone is on the same page, that all of your concerns are addressed, and that everyone is really aligned on the reserve study. And then most inspections will conclude that same day. The kickoff meetings usually in the morning. We'll meet for, say, an hour. It could be anywhere from 15 minutes to 2 hours. It really depends on the level of questions. But the reserve specialist will be there after that meeting, evaluating the community, and usually conclude that same day. So how do you, as a board or manager, facilitate that inspection? What's your role in that? It is helpful to notify residents ahead of time. The reserve specialist typically will be walking around with a notepad, taking notes, and a camera, documenting condition with photographs. So it's very, very common for homeowners to become a little alarmed or puzzled that someone's walking around and they want to know what's going on. Usually we are identified with a logo on a shirt or a business card, and we can answer any questions that they have. But if homeowners know that someone will be coming to the property inspecting, that's typically helpful. Again, we do encourage that board involvement initially, both at the meeting and the inspection. So if that retaining wall you're concerned about, if you want to walk over there, we can go look at it together, point out the areas of concern that you have. If you wanted to understand how we're going to handle a certain thing, we're happy to walk over there with you, kind of do an overview of the community and answer any specific questions. But it is really important to make sure that the reserve specialist does have some independent time to conduct that inspection, right? It's kind of challenging to talk to, Mary or Paul about their concerns while we're also focusing on the condition and measuring, right? So we're happy to do that kind of walkthrough overview with you, but then please do make sure that you allow some time for the reserve specialist to really conduct and focus on that condition and the measurements and really gathering the information that they need to prepare the reserve study. So again, your involvement in the inspection is limited to that first part. We'll do the meeting and then kind of look at the community together, and that really the time commitment, I guess, is up to the board as far as how much they want to show the reserve specialists individually. So after that meeting and the inspection, you have a little break. The reserve specialist is putting together the study, crunching the numbers, really gathering all the data that they need and putting together that full report for you. And then typically you'll receive it via email, maybe a hard copy as well. So once you receive it, how do you interpret it? What do you do with this document? You know by law that you need to follow the contributions or the recommendations, but what does it look like? How do you pull that information out? It's really going to vary by the specialist that prepares your reserve study, right? The actual, what the format, what it looks like. But there are some key points of the reserve study that no matter who prepares it, will be there, right? If you're having a study done by a reserve specialist, it's typically going to have these main sections. So we'll have an executive summary right up front. This typically provides concise, high-level overview of the findings of the reserve study. So it's typically a page or two, really high-level detail. So again, this is the actual format. What it looks like will vary, but this is all the information that you can pull out of it. All executive summaries will have that funding goal. How was the funding goal determined? What is really driving our reserve contributions? What projects should we focus on? What are our real near-term needs of the association? And then ultimately, what is that funding recommendation? How much should we be contributing to reserves? All that's usually right up front in an executive summary. The next kind of key part is that expenditure plan. And so this is what's developed based on that physical evaluation, right? So again, format might look differently, but all of this information is there. Every reserve study is going to have that inventory of those elements that we're saying should be funded through reserves. Every reserve study is going to have quantification for those components. It's going to have useful life information, which is typically, you know, that time frame. Do we need to do this project typically every 15 to 20 to 25 years? It's going to have that recommended timing. When should the association anticipate the need to replace the carpet or replace the roofs? And then it's going to have the cost. So what's the unit cost? What's the per phase cost? If it's a phase project, what's the total cost? All of this information will be there. So I like to kind of describe it as like a matrix. You can have really detailed information. You can pull out, if you're really focused on the balconies or the pool furniture, you can look at all the specifics associated with that line item, or you can look at it by year. In 2022, what should we anticipate? What are our needs for this next fiscal year? And that expenditure plan will really then kind of dovetail into the reserve funding needs, right? So when we say reserve funding, there's a couple ways to do it. There's a cash flow analysis, which is most common and what we strongly recommend. That does assume that it's typically one big pot of money. You keep your reserves all in one account, unless you do have a unique situation where maybe there's some commercial components and then you have a residential reserve and a general reserve, then that would be different because those are two different reserve accounts, right? You'd have two separate expenditure plans and cash flows. But this does provide funding recommendation for that one big pot of money. So this means if you're in association with a pool and a clubhouse and a condominium and you maintain the exterior buildings and in the pavement, it's saying you're going to fund all of those various projects through this one pooled reserve account, which is really typical. If you had all these separate reserve accounts, one for the roofs, one for the masonry, one for the pavement, one for the pool furniture, one for the pool plaster, it gets really difficult to manage. So it is very common to have one big reserve account, which is what we recommend. And this truly is a cash flow analysis. So you're providing us that starting balance for the current fiscal year. You're going to provide us your current budgeted contributions. We're going to incorporate interest in any planned projects you have to come up with a projected year-end balance. And then our recommendations are really going to begin typically in the following year and on. And it truly is cash flow. So how much do you have at the start of the year? What are the contributions we're recommending? We're going to incorporate interest. we're going to take out those expenses that we're budgeting for to come up with a projected year-end balance that becomes the following year balance. So I think this is easiest to understand in a graph. So we like to include a graph. This is really a great tool for the average homeowner to understand the importance of reserves. So I always encourage clients to share this at like an annual meeting, especially if you have to increase fees. This really helps them wrap their heads around the importance of reserves. So the red, and this is truly just a graphical form of that cash flow. So this is the same example. And in this example, the red bars are the expenditures by year. So let's just say reserves didn't exist. Essentially, you'd have to special assess or have these huge fluctuations in your budget to offset these expenditures, which is really difficult to manage, right? That uncertainty is very difficult for both a board and individual homeowner. It's hard to plan your finances around these huge fluctuations, which is why we have reserves, right? So the green bars here are the recommended reserve contribution. And the blue line is that reserve balance. So if you didn't have a reserve study, it's very easy for an association to say, you know what, we have almost $600,000 in reserves. We look around, looks pretty good. We don't see any near-term needs. Looks like everything's in relatively good shape. We had these insurance increases. Let's not fund reserves, right? Well, without that, this association wouldn't, without a reserve study, wouldn't know that just 5 years out from now, they have these years where they're expending much more than they're contributing, right? And they're draining that reserve account, which really is ideal. The goal of reserves isn't to keep it artificially high forever. We don't want you to have $600,000 in the bank at all time and money just sitting there. You do want to fund, kind of build up for the needs of the association. And then when you have those years of really big expenditures, you're draining that reserve account, which is great. Typically, a reserve specialist is going to recommend pretty close to zero. We're going to find that critical year. It does become a little bit more of an art than a science. The reason we don't want to go right down to zero is because there could be fluctuations, right? Costs could change. We've seen that with COVID. There could be something that ends up moving up, a weather condition, and it really deteriorates something. And so timing has to change. So there usually is a buffer in there. We don't want it up at $600,000, but we don't want you right at zero. So we'll kind of, that's what we do. It's our specialty. So we will kind of look at the big picture and determine what a comfortable kind of cushion is for you, where you're draining that reserve account. But then that's why we like to go out 30 years, because it's important not to just say, whew, well, we're through that. We don't need to replace the roofs for 20 years. We're good. We could just stop contributing to reserves, right? You really need to continue to build up that reserve account, keep continuing to contribute to reserves. So because just out in another 20 years, you're going to have these years where there are huge, huge, huge expenditures. So you need to build that reserve account and then drain it again. So this really, I think, is a graphical form, and it truly is just of this funding plan. You can see here out in 2026, there's that critical year. So this is that year where we were draining that reserve account. Like I said, we didn't bring it quite down to zero. We left about $60,000 in the bank. And so this is what the reserve specialist is going to tell you and what they're going to provide. And then next, it's very typical for a reserve study to have a narrative section. So when we say replace a life safety system or repave the streets, what does that mean? This is where you're really going to get those details, right? What's the history of the element? What condition is it in? The condition typically is documented with photographs. So if we say something's in poor condition and you need to do the project in the next couple of years, we're going to show you why. We're going to show you those concerns that we're seeing. And then it's also meant to help educate you on the component. So what's going on beneath the pavement that we see? When you say repaving, what does that entail? This is where you can really get some additional information on those expenses. So when it's time to comes time to complete the project, you have that independent opinion on the most cost-effective way to maintain the property. And then, of course, if you have any questions when you receive your reserve study, if something doesn't make sense, or even if you just want a general overview, just ask. The reserve specialist is there. That's her job. This is what we do. And we're happy to help answer any questions you have and really kind of refine the study and make sure that it's a usable product for you. And then that really concludes my section of the presentation. I think we might have received some additional questions.
Yeah, there's some questions there in the chat. I think there's a good one here from Dan where he's asking, due to the current global supply chain challenges, all types of building materials are significantly more expensive from the last time we had our reserve study performed. Will our reserve study factor in current building material pricing or an expected replacement pricing cost for materials based on historical trends?
Yeah, and that's a great question because a reserve study is very snapshot in time, right? What are the costs at this time? We do incorporate inflation, but things like a pandemic are difficult to predict. So if you had a study done a few years ago and you're tackling a project right now, the cost is probably pretty substantially different. So it's sort of a fine line where studies that we're doing now, if they're not going to need to replace their roofs for 15 years, we don't necessarily want to show costs reflective of today. We're hoping that the market will stabilize within 15 years and prices will return to normal, whatever that new normal is, right? And that's what we are working on as a group too. That's something we talk about daily, weekly, monthly. We're keeping our arms around that because there are a lot of various external factors, things like labor shortages and labor increases, that probably isn't going to go away entirely, right? So we are going up on replacement costs. But things like supply chain, that ideally will work itself out. So if it's a near-term project, we're probably going up to be conservative because it's not going to be resolved that we don't think next year. But if it's 15 years out, that is something that we would typically not, we assume that it's going to stabilize.
Let's see, there was a question in the question and answer. I guess this is about getting, if you don't have any assets. So an engineer can certify that a reserve study isn't needed, but it must be completed every year. What you can have is the engineer just really say that, I've examined this association, they do not have any assets, therefore there isn't a need for them to set aside funds in a reserve account because they don't have any assets. Again, I find that really rare for in a community not to have any assets whatsoever, but even a sidewalk or something. But if that truly is indeed the case, then you can have a letter from a certified engineer stating that, and that would satisfy, and you would need to get that done every 5 years. That is correct. And that would satisfy that component in the law.
And that's what we're doing too. We do have clients that truly have nothing, that they mow the grass, they have open space, but there's nothing that qualifies as a reserve component. So we write a really brief letter. It's obviously much cheaper than a full-blown reserve study because you're still having an engineer come to the property to look and verify, but as opposed to having this full expenditure plan and funding plan, it's just a really brief letter saying that you're kind of exempt from it. So that is a service that all reserve study providers can provide as well.
Sure. And then that leads to one of the other questions in the chat, Michelle. What's the average cost for a reserve study?
And that's a great question. It really will vary based on the amount of time that we estimate it'll take the engineer to prepare the reserve study, right? So if it's this letter where you only have, you don't have any reserve components, that's more like $900, where if you are a large high-rise building, 300 units, you might be closer to $10,000, right? But for an average HOA, a good budgetary number, anywhere from say 3,000 to 5,000. Now, if you're one of the communities that just has like a monument and a fence out front, that's cheaper. That's more closer to that $1,000, $1,500 range. But it really will vary based on the elements you have. So as part of the reserve, the proposal process, I have that conversation on the front end to really get my arm around the scope of work.
Right. Now that makes sense. The bigger the community, probably the larger the reserve study.
Exactly.
Okay. Let's see. There's a couple other questions here. What else is going on? Oh, so Jack is asking, can you summarize the 3 types of reserve studies?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's a great question. There's actually 4 now. See, I just introduced a 4th. So a level 1 reserve study is a full reserve study from scratch. You've never had one done before, or you're going with a new provider and they're performing a full reserve study. Now there's a level 2 reserve study, and that's an update with a site visit. There are some providers, full transparency, that will update a different provider study. Personally, we do not. We feel like it's a little misleading for us to put our name on someone else's inventory and quantification. But there are some that will do a level 2 with each other's studies. And the level 2 study will satisfy the law. A level 1 and level 2 will satisfy the law because it's having that inspection. All the components are being verified, and it's a full report. Typically, an update study will look the same as a full study. It's just reusing that inventory and quantification. There's a level 3 study, so that's a non-site update, typically handled more via conference call. So maybe using the example of the current pricing scenario that we're in right now, if you had a study done 5 years, or let's say 2 years ago, and you need to replace things pretty soon and you want to incorporate the current costs, that's typically more of a conference call. You provide us your new starting balance. We go over any changes that have occurred, items are repriced out, and you receive a report. That will not satisfy the law because it does not have that condition assessment or inspection of the community. And then the newest is a level 4 reserve study, and that's one from plans. So brand new communities, often with developers, will have reserve studies done from plans. So we're not inspecting anything because it doesn't exist, but really we're quantifying from plans, and we're saying, you know, the developer is providing us with timing, saying we're going to build this clubhouse next year, the roads are going to go in the following year. So it is assumption based that everything's going to go in good condition. But it at least provides that developer a starting reserve contribution so that they can get the association started off the right foot.
Right. And Michelle, so the level 1, that's the initial one, the one that's never been done before. And then the level 2 is kind of building off of that level 1. So I guess would you say that the price for the level 2 would be maybe a little lower than that level 1 because you're already building off of that?
Yes, great question. And it is. It's typically, general rule of thumb, maybe 75% the cost of a full study because you can reuse some of that data. The level 3 is much cheaper because you're not inspecting the property and redoing things. So that's usually more, let's say an average community has, let's say it's a $5,000 full study, maybe an update might be like 3,500-ish, maybe 4,000. And then the level 3, where it's just a conference call, that's closer to say 1,000, maybe 1,200, something like that. So it steps down based on the time and involvement.
Okay, good. So if you just keep, staying on track, it's not going to cost you as much in the long run than if you kind of fall off and forget to do it then.
Exactly. And most providers actually now will, just with technology advancements, most providers do provide an Excel file or some sort of workable file. So if you don't want to necessarily have the professional update it, if you, for any of these sort of in-between changes between the 5 years, you guys as a board can go in and keep up with your cash flow and make sure you're kind of staying current in between professional updates.
Okay. Let's see, I see another question in the chat. When you increase assessments based on reserve study, do those funds go directly to the reserve study? How do you split the increase for normal maintenance and reserve funds? So earlier when I was talking about increasing the assessments above your cap, so if you are a community where you have a cap within your governing documents, but you need to increase your budget and access to the cap in order to comply with the new law, in order to make sure you're properly funding reserves, that increase above the cap has to go solely to your reserve fund. So now if you're increasing your assessments and you're within your cap and you're able to fund your reserves also too within your cap, how those increased assessments are allocated is really going to be based on the board's decision. And you can determine how those funds are split, based on the community's needs. But if you have to increase your assessments above what your required cap is in your governing documents in order to adhere with the law, then that increase needs to go directly to the reserve, so you're not in violation of your governing documents. So hopefully that makes sense.
And I will say that's a really nice part of the Maryland law that Virginia doesn't have. Virginia does require the studies every 5 years, but boards don't have the ability to supersede the document. So I work with associations and they're just so frustrated because they're doing the board is doing their fiduciary responsibility, having the study conducted, but they're underfunded and they can't increase more than that 3 or 5%. And their hands are really tied because they can't get the homeowners to even show up to vote to increase fees. So they want to tackle these projects. They want to do the right thing and increase fees, but they can't because of the way that the law doesn't give them the ability to do that. So that was really great that it was incorporated into these bills.
Yeah, great. All right, let's see. There's another question from Kathy. Please address new/change in board, some recommended projects not done or more less money spent than recommended. I guess I'm just trying to understand. Let's see. I mean, I don't know, Kathy, if you can kind of clarify that question in the chat. But you know, like was said earlier, the whole thing with reserves is really for funding your capital improvements. And as Michelle said, you know, if your association doesn't have all the funds there to pay for everything all at once, they definitely will work with you in trying to prioritize which projects you know, that need to get done sooner rather than later, or which projects the board should prioritize first, and then maybe wait a little longer and addressing and things like that. So your reserve specialist, I think, can help you with that in terms of prioritizing your projects and determining the money that you need to set aside, as well as the amount of money you're going to need to spend this year and next year and the upcoming year. So I think, you know, reserve specialists can certainly assist you with that.
Yeah, and the reserve, yeah, if a project was recommended, let's say for 2024, and it comes to 2024 and you as a board don't think you need to do the project, you can always call the reserve specialist and say, hey, is this something we can kind of hold off on, or is this something that is a must, or what should we do about this? Like in our report, we do actually include a section like criticality and say board can defer, or it's best to seek an independent opinion from a contractor or from a licensed engineer, depending on it. If it's something structural, like maybe a retaining wall, you probably should have it checked out, not just a visual, like, I think it's okay. So usually that recommendation can be provided if it's not included in your report, as far as what items you can decide as a board to defer versus what needs to be done right away.
Absolutely, absolutely. Stephen, I think when Michelle sends out the materials to everyone, we'll include our contact information with that as well. But you were asking, what are the penalties if the board decides not to fund in accordance with their reserve study? And so under both the Condo Act and the HOA Act, the Attorney General's office does have the right to enforce certain provisions of both of those acts. And so if a board is not adhering to following this new law in Prince George's County and Montgomery County, then that could get reported to the Attorney General's office, which would then probably open up an investigation as to what's going on and why the board is not funding in accordance with the newly enacted law there. So that would be the, I guess, the teeth there in terms of enforcement. Let's see. And let's see, Ms. Davis is asking, what happens when the reserve study recommendation increases more than reasonable for 1 year?
I think I can take that one or take a stab at it. That's something I would work with your reserve specialist on to try and make it as manageable as possible. Using that example of the critical and the prioritization, the reserve specialist should be willing to defer some of those things, even though, yeah, it'd be ideal to replace the carpet. Let's hold off because funds aren't available. And most will phase those contributions. Let's say you're contributing reserves at $20,000, and after the study is completed, you really should be contributing more like $100,000 annually. Most reserve specialists aren't going to say, okay, let's contribute $100,000 next year, right? We want to make it as manageable as possible, but we also don't want to spread that out too far. The goal is to start contributing reserves as soon as possible to get you on track. So in that instance, we might phase it over 3, 4, 5 years. 5 years is kind of our max for phasing, but most reserve specialists will work with you to try and come up with a reasonable situation. That's not always the case, unfortunately, using the Surfside example, right? Like they didn't have the time. They needed to do things right away and had trouble doing it because they were so drastically underfunded. So it is a bit of an art with the science, but we will work with you to try and make it as manageable as possible without sacrificing the integrity or structural components of the community.
Yeah. And I think that goes to the next question here from Ms. Peterson. How long are you allowed to bring your reserves up to the funding requirements? And are there any penalties for Montgomery or Prince George's County? So the counties are not going to enact any penalties against you, but I think it is important for you to work with whoever is helping you with your reserve study to try to figure out a game plan that will try to, work as best for your community. And so, the law doesn't require when you have to come into compliance in terms of the funding minimum requirements. The biggest thing that the law is requiring is that you have, like I said earlier, 1 year to get that reserve study done if you have not had it done within the last 5 years. And then it's up to you as a community and as a board to make sure you're working within your budget and working with your reserve study specialists and getting your funds to the place where they should be in accordance with that report that you're going to receive. And so, yeah, and then, okay, I see Kathy kind of clarified there. 3 years in, some projects have been done and other projects, some projects have not been done and other projects done instead. And that's typical, like Michelle was saying earlier, and I don't know, Michelle, if you want to elaborate, sometimes communities have to prioritize which projects get done and which ones don't, maybe because of budget constraints. So, that doesn't mean you're in violation of the law, as long as you're still properly funding for those projects.
Yeah, and that's bound to happen. A reserve study is a great budgetary tool, but it truly is just that. It's not meant to be where you have to do these projects exactly when they were indicated they need to be done. Because there might be something, maybe the roofs we thought had another 10 years life and a hailstorm comes through and you need to replace your roofs, next year. That doesn't mean you need to wait 10 years. By all means, condition will govern. And that's a good example of maybe you should update ahead of that 5-year cycle, right? Because if you're going to have to replace your roofs instead of 10 years, you need to do it now. That's going to drastically change your reserve balance. And you're probably going to have to increase fees to kind of make up for that. And the sooner that you update the study, kind of get the finances back on track, the less painful it'll be, right? It's like anything else, the sooner you do it, the more time you have, and it makes it a little bit more manageable. The longer you wait, the more makeup time you have. The roofs don't care if you started funding at year 15 instead of year 0. If they need to be funded at, replaced in 20 years, the sooner you do it, the more time you have to build up those funds.
And it looks like the last question, and this is probably for you, Michelle. Please discuss the advisability of financing some improvement. I don't know if you want to take that or.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the goal of reserves, if you're adequately funding reserves, you ideally won't have to finance or to special assess, right? The goal is to have the funds available to pull from them at the time. So we would never say, if you're responsible for the windows, we would never say, you know what, we're not going to show that reserve expense because we're going to assume you're going to finance the project. Ideally, you would start funding for those windows because it goes to the whole fiduciary responsibility, informing homeowners. Everyone knows that the association, to the best of their ability and to the reserve specialist ability, is planning for all these long-term needs. Now, that being said, if you're in a situation where you need to replace your windows in 2 years and you have no money available to do that, that might be the only option, right? And so we have worked with associations. Sometimes they want financing projects completely excluded from the reserve study. It's going to be done in a, handled separately, and that's just mentioned as an exclusion for a near term that we know is happening. Or we might show it. We might show, there's this $1 million project in 2 years. Here's the expense. the association has a loan, we're going to show that as an additional reserve contribution that's contributing to that reserve account to fund that project. And then we're going to show that loan payback as an expense. So loans can kind of be included or excluded from a reserve study, typically excluded, but sometimes associations do want to see them, and that can be done. Is financing an acceptable reserve funding technique? No. Yes and no. If you have to, if it's an older community, you might not have another option, right? But if it's a brand new community, we wouldn't recommend anticipating financing. We don't want you to plan, if you don't need to repay for another 15 years, we don't want you to plan on financing that repaving project 15 years from now. We want you to put away money each year so that when the time comes, you can pull from the reserve. Because financing isn't free, right? It's important to remember that money, it's not like the bank is just giving you that money. You're going to have to drastically increase your fees to pay back that loan. So it's not much different from a special assessment. It's essentially spreading that special assessment out, where ideally those that are using those components, that are using the windows, using the pool, using the clubhouse, should be contributing to that eventual replacement or maintenance of those components.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I think those are all the questions that I see in the chat. Hopefully, I'm just scrolling up just to make sure we didn't miss anything. But these were all super great questions, guys. So really appreciate it. Oh, I did answer the question in the chat. Someone asked, I heard that Montgomery County's law had a provision that if the HOA's assets are under a certain threshold, no reserve study would be required. Is that true? And I just put in the chat, no, that's not true. HB 567, which is the Montgomery County bill, does not have that provision in the bill. There was some discussion about exempting certain communities or having some type of threshold during the session, but that was not included in the final bill that was passed.
That's everything I see too. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate everyone's time and attention and great questions. We will be sending this out. We'll send the recording as well as the slides. So feel free to share with any board members, colleagues, anyone that you see fit. Get the information out there. We're here and happy that everyone's able to learn about the new law and the requirements of it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Oh, Steve just dropped a question in the chat, Michelle. How about HOAs of a certain size and units? That was part of the discussion with the original bill in Prince George's County. It initially did exempt HOAs of a certain size, but then it was later taken out of the bill based on a lot of feedback that we had received that actually it's typically the smaller associations that don't have reserves, that need reserves, versus the other way around. And so that language was actually stricken from the initial version of the bill and not included. So hopefully that answers your question, Steve. Thank you guys so much. This has been so great. And yeah, keep in touch.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Have a great day.